Gospel according to Luke, 14th chapter. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Okay, before we get started, I want you to stop and think, how does this story make you feel? Like, not as a Bible story, but like as a story that someone is telling you about their weekend. They went to this party. And there was this guy who got invited to the party. And he made this scene. He made this huge, awkward scene. Why is he even here? Why did he accept this invitation? And can you see everyone at this party sort of turning kind of red because they're all trying to sit down, and this guy starts telling them they're doing it wrong. And they're sort of side-eyeing this like scruffy feral preacher who showed up at their nice party, and he's now telling them they're doing it wrong. And maybe even worse, there's that awful realization that they know he's not wrong. But who is he to tell them how to do their nice parties? So at this point, they've all had been just like humiliated and fuming at this guy. Who does he think he is to make a scene at their nice party? And so the more I thought about this story this week, the one question that I kept coming back to was, what was the host expecting to happen when he invited Jesus to his nice party? Because typically in this culture, the expectation is you invite someone to a party, and then the invitation is returned. You go to each other's parties, and there's this give and take. But Jesus didn't have a nice house to host a nice party. So the host can't have invited him with the expectation of getting an invitation back. So what was he trying to get out of this instead? What did he want to happen when he invited Jesus to his party? What did he want? We know that Jesus was being closely watched. But what are they watching for? Are they plotting and scheming and looking for weaknesses or excuses to get him in trouble? We know at this point he's been healing on the Sabbath. We heard about that last week. And in fact, it's not in here, but there's a gap between the first verse and the rest of it where he does it again. He does another Sabbath healing in the middle of this passage. In the previous chapter, some people come to Jesus to tell him Herod wants to kill him. So maybe this is about information, maybe manipulation, political maneuvering, all that kind of scheming. Maybe it's just entertainment. If Jesus comes to someone's party and does something exciting and dramatic, everyone's going to be talking about that for weeks or even months. So maybe the host wanted some sort of like tame revolutionary to do something shocking so everyone could be like, "Oh, can you believe he did that?" And then they can talk about it and argue about it. But at any rate, the host was clearly expecting something interesting to happen. And yes, whatever the motivation was, he got what he was looking for. There was a very controversial healing on the Sabbath. But that's not the part we're focusing on today. That's the part the host expected, Jesus doing some healing so everyone can be awed and argue about it. We're looking at the fun part, where Jesus made everything awkward for everyone. And this is one of my favorite types of stories about Jesus, where the important people put him on the spot to try to get something out of him or to prove a point, and he upsets all their expectations and turns the focus back on them. Someone wealthy and important hosting a party invited Jesus, and instead of doing the thing that you usually do when someone invites you to a nice party, which is to be like, "Oh, you have a lovely home, thanks for having me, everything looks great," you know the routine, Jesus instead starts telling everyone at the party how they're doing all the things wrong that they are doing at this party. So I like to picture Jesus having already found a seat, and he's sat down, and now he's waiting for everyone else to get their act together so he can start eating. And then after making all the other guests awkward by pointing out all the scheming and angling that they're doing, trying to find the best seat, that they probably all thought they were being very tactful and subtle about. You know, they probably do this at every party. But then, so after he points out this thing that they thought they were being like real, you know, they were being real smooth about it, and he points it out and puts them on the spot, then he goes on to embarrass the host about how he chose these very guests. It's like this piling of awkwardness upon awkwardness. And it's one thing if he does it during like one of his sermons on a hillside. Like, you know, if everyone had like shown up to learn something. Because when you go visit a teacher, that's sort of like an acceptable kind of discomfort. Like you know going there that at least theoretically you don't know everything, so maybe this person has someone to tell you. But he does this at the beginning of dinner to a captive audience. So everyone after this, everyone now has to just sit there together and try to eat and make conversation for the next several hours. They thought they were going to be getting one thing out of dinner: information, political weapon, a fun story. Maybe they got those things, but they also got this. So I wonder what they did with it after they all went home. Did this make it into entertaining anecdotes about that one time they went to a party and that popular new rabbi was there? Or did it turn into one of those quietly agreed upon, let us never speak of this again kind of situations with that group of friends? So now, we like to imagine what we would do if Jesus showed up at church. We encourage Jesus to be present with us. This is a thing that we actively want to happen. We pray for it, we meditate on it, we ask God to come and bless us. But a thing I don't think we consider often enough is the possibility that it would be extremely awkward. What if he looks around at some typical Sunday morning behavior that we're all so used to we don't even notice it anymore? Like, I don't know, sitting in the back or whatever, and he turns into a centerpiece for this whole lecture about everything we're doing wrong. Jesus was invited to this party for one reason, and he turned it into a completely different experience for the guests. So why do we invite Jesus into church every week? What are we expecting will happen? Well, for one thing, like we heard about last week, there's healing, and it's beautiful and holy and good. And then once we've invited Jesus in to do the healing, or to answer the questions, or to give us guidance or strength or whatever, he's not going to stop there. Yes, Jesus healed someone right in the middle of this story, and then he kept right on going because we have no control over this situation. It looks like we do. We have it printed off right. I have a whole binder. It looks like we have control of the situation, but we do not. We pray and sing and read and get this and that blessing and we go home. But when Jesus shows up, all bets are off. We can't invite Jesus into our spaces to answer a prayer or an invitation without bracing ourselves to the possibility that whatever happens next may be deeply, deeply uncomfortable. What super mundane thing that we all take for granted is going to turn out to actually be a window into something deeply wrong with our souls? What if he points at me and says, hey, you always sit in the back, and sometimes you zone out and check your phone? And then everyone else who also sits in the back and sometimes zones out is going to sort of squirm around nervously, and he's going to tell us all some deep spiritual truth that will cut us to the bone. Jesus knows everything about us. He knows what we're doing and what we're thinking and what we're insecure about and how we choose the people we want to spend time with and invite to our parties and who we definitely do not want to come to our parties. And he has opinions. Are you feeling all paranoid now? Because I am. I mean, honestly, I'm kind of an overthinker. Maybe you've noticed that over the years. Sometimes I'll be trying to make some kind of difficult decision, and I'll be about to pray or meditate on it, and then I'll stop and I'll be like, wait a second. Wait 1 second. I know what I'm hoping will come out of this, and I have this sudden sinking feeling that whatever's going to actually happen if I seriously set myself to learning the will of God or whatever, those are going to be very different things. The things I'm about to learn about myself when I get that message from God and have to decide what to do about it are probably going to be unpleasant. Am I prepared to deal with that? To either make a decision that I really, really do not want to make, or to discover myself to be the kind of person who knows what they are supposed to do and then chooses not to do it anyway. And sometimes I decide it's not worth the hassle and I just make the decision, and then I just move on. And sometimes I try to face it, and when I do, I learn even more things about myself. Sometimes I learn I can do the hard things, and sometimes I learn I still have a very long way to go. So, how are we going to respond to those times when we've invited Jesus into a situation and gotten the healing and the strength and the guidance, and then we get the awkwardness, the discomfort, the embarrassment? We don't know how the other guests or the host of this party reacted to Jesus. I looked ahead to check. I read ahead, and all we get is a little more conversation about banquets, and then it moves on to another story. So we don't know how many people who had been at this table and heard this story chose to host parties the way that Jesus advised, or if they changed how they seated themselves when they were guests. But it stuck with someone. We know at least someone remembered. Someone held on to this memory and this discomfort and thought it was valuable and worth passing on. When we find ourselves stuck in a situation and pinned awkwardly to our seats, hearing words we really do not want to hear right now, words that make us realize we really did not understand a situation, or that something we did made things worse or hurt someone else, that discomfort is important. Instead of pushing it aside and trying to forget it, we need to hold on to it and wrestle with it. The person who told Luke this story, because Luke was not there. Luke showed up years later and went and hunted down all these people who knew Jesus and asked them all these questions and interviewed them with his little notebook and everything. And someone told Luke this story. And the person who told Luke this story, years later, probably had turned it over and over in their mind for years. So, likewise, when we find ourselves in one of those painful situations where we're learning something about ourselves that hurts or makes us cringe, can't try to evade it. Instead, we need to consider, why does this make us uncomfortable? Discomfort means something is wrong. Something needs to be changed. If we're feeling that, we need to adjust something. And if we don't pay attention to the feeling, if we try to squash it down, then we'll just be stuck in that same wrong situation. So, when we invite Jesus into our home, or our church, or our hearts, because we want him to help us with one thing, we need to be prepared for him to point out things that need to be changed that we didn't even notice. And it's going to be awkward and uncomfortable. And it's probably going to hurt, and maybe it's going to be embarrassing. But if we pay attention, hold on to that discomfort, and follow it to its source, we can learn and grow from it, and maybe later we can pass the story on to someone else. Because if Jesus is involved, no awkward situation is ever wasted. Thanks be to God.